Sean's a moral monster because of the clothes he buys. Since my clothes are roughly equivalent generally to what people wear in the third world, I'm pretty sure. I want to talk about three things today. Basically what Sean did was to set up a moral structure whereby he appealed to an intuition within us that a baby lying in a pond at the side of the road was a responsibility that we bear. So a lot of my first point is essentially going to be why the justifications of first opposition are insufficient. Then I'm going to talk about why we establish ethical burdens and why we can establish them for acts and omissions. We think this isn't just an omission, it is an act, but even if it was just an omission, we'd still have moral responsibility, and then talk about probabilism and risk. Because what he stood up here and said was essentially, implicitly in his case, was that Africans wouldn't live lives worth living anyway. What makes life worth living? Opera houses. We didn't say you had to sacrifice every good thing in life. We said you had to sacrifice until your level of sacrifice was approaching a comparable good. So educate your children, Mr. Speaker, but don't educate them in a private school until you want a textbook for orphans living in Africa as well. He said, but we're not God, we can't play these sorts of games. No, but we do have a duty to be as ethically sound as possible, Mr. Speaker. That brings us closer to our conceptions of God generally. He said it will be a drop in the ocean. What standard is he using? What status of individual does he take? It will be a drop in the ocean viewed collectively. Viewed individually, it will be the entire world of the life you can save with that £20 that you donate to Oxfam. If I pull out a gun and murder one of you, that's a drop in the ocean as far as the English population is concerned. But in terms of ethical responsibility, it's the difference between being an ethically sound individual and being a little Eichmann who stands by and does nothing. They said, oh, but what if it's a baby machine that put them in there? That completely mitigates your ethical responsibility. Say it was a machine, say it was a train crashed in the pond and there's lots of babies there. Multiplying the number of babies doesn't make it more ethically sound to leave any one individual baby drowning until you feel your life is significantly endangered. And then he told us it's about a structural change. That's what will make the biggest difference. We kind of agree. If that's the case, structural change would make a great big difference. We think that donating all of your income to Africa would send an incredibly powerful political signal to every political party to say, look, I'd like to spend some of my income, but I can't do an ethical responsibility. They'll take notice and stand up and actually lobby for those sorts of structural changes. At best, he's given us an argument for donating all of your discretionary income to lobbying the government to effect structural change, not for going away entirely and leaving all the babies to drown. So is there responsibility for acts and omissions? Tom.
Okay, you're basically proposing the adoption of a moral framework. If we can prove that the adoption of that framework leads to less good, will you recognise your framework as suboptimal? Yeah, that's fine. If you can prove that this will lead to, say, more babies dying more horrific deaths, that would be a very good start indeed. Secondly, on responsibility for acts and omissions. Mr. Speaker, what Sean told us in his speech is that everything you do, instead of the act which you ought to perpetrate to do the most good, is an act. And therefore it's unable to be associated with a false acts-omissions distinction, which, as Tom assured us in the Euros final, doesn't exist in debate land. It is by acts that you have associated yourself with these structural changes, which they in first opposition are more than happy to blame the problems. It is by acts that you stay here in this country on the lifeboat and justify and give legitimacy to a government which has structurally set up a system whereby there is IMF power for the richest nations, whereby agricultural and trade laws are benefiting you, and every time you commit the act of buying a luxury good, Mr. Speaker, you benefit from cheap labour in the third world, you consume a scarce resource base of resources that could have been better channeled elsewhere, and you help to encourage the industrialization of the world, which creates the pollution and global warming, which harms the poorest. All of those are acts, Mr. Speaker, and just because there are others who stand with you on the thresholds of a gas chamber doesn't mean that your moral responsibility has been in any way vitiated whatsoever. Moreover, what we say is that you assume moral responsibility for acts, even if you don't know the moral responsibility you're assuming, even if you don't recognise it. Mr. Speaker, if like very, very hypothetically, if I ever had sex, and if I created a child by it, I would be responsible for that action, even if I don't want to be a father. The action I have created associates me with a moral person with needs and interests, and puts me in their stead. Why is there a duty of care? For all of the reasons I just named, for all the reasons I just named is how you act. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, by acting and purchasing these goods, by being a citizen of the first world, we act in such a way that others are not able to act to save the starving African. Because of the structural changes that I've already proven that we justify, we have created a world in which a starving African orphan cannot be cared for by his government, cannot be cared for by his family. We have taken on that moral responsibility in the same way that the parent who locks their child in the room must be responsible should the child starve. Finally, on to the idea of risks. Because they said, well, we can't know what's going to happen, Mr. Speaker. They're right, we can't know what's going to happen. But what Sean gives you is a metric for actually judging the moral validity of a particular action by saying what happens when probabilism approaches 100%. You might not save a single African by sending 20 pounds to Oxfam, but it's more likely than not you'll save 5 or 6. So we think that's a really good moral action. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, if I put one bullet in a 6-chamber revolver and fire it blankly into the audience, even though the probability is stacked up against anyone dying, I'm morally responsible for not taking the most moral action. We can only say we disassociate ourselves from the harms of our risks if we would have been happy to bear those risks ourselves. That's what Sean tells you from the very first. That the ethical person is the one who buys into the golden rule, who buys into all the moral teaching of Western and indeed the Eastern tradition, of saying we put ourselves in the shoes of another person and ask if we would be content to swap places. That is the origin of ethics. It's recognizing that risks themselves are things we create by acts, not merely omissions, and that by omission we act as well, by justifying the sorts of regimes which have created these structural absurdities. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, if we wish to dissociate ourselves ethically from these sorts of actions which happen, we must do all we can to mitigate them. It might mean that we place immense moral burdens on ourselves, but that's the price of being a good person. Isn't that you always get to self-actualize in your favourite way, but that you recognise someone else is good to self-actualize is more activated, even if all you do is save them from a lifetime of agony, dying from vitamin A deficiency or schistosomiasis. They may never set foot in an opera theatre, but if you can give them that moment's repose, that minute's solace or peace from the conditions in which you and your fellow countrymen have placed them, we say you've done the right thing by them, you've done the right thing by yourself in any good ethical credo, and that's why we're so very proud of the folks. Thanks very much.